Book 2 Between 1. The slate-gray sea roiled, scraping the narrow strip of sand rhythmically, tugging at beach grass, digging and sucking loose the rocks at the shore's edge. Spray stung the men's eye when they went to tighten the ropes holding their boats secure. Salt coated their beards and eyebrows. They pulled their woven hat brims low. Old Benedict cupped his hand above his eyes and peered upward, assessing the sky through the pelting rain. "It won't break for a while," he called. "Not till night." But his words were carried off by the stiff wind, and the others, tugging and twisting at the coarse ropes, didn't hear him, didn't reply. The women remained in their cottages. Fighting the weather was men's work. The women listened to the wind as it roared in the chimneys, to the ripping sounds of torn thatch, and to the whimpering of frightened children. They tended the fires, stirred the soups, rocked the babies, and waited. This storm would pass. The sea would calm. It always had. In the time that came after the story of water, Claire took off different forms. It was told and retold. Things were forgotten or shaped and changed. Always, though, there was this truth, that she came from the sea, flung in by that fearsome December storm years before. Some said she was found, later, when the scudding clouds pulled aside and showed low sun in early evening. That she was there on the strip of beach, her clothes half torn from her, and they thought she was dead, till she stirred and her eyes opened to show the deep amber-flecked green that later all remembered the same. Others said no, it was tall Andras who saw her in the waves, who threw himself in and grabbed her by her long hair as she clung to a thick wood beam, that he swam with her till he could stand, and when they looked he was there in the churning broth of sea with her in his thick arms, her head against his beard, and that he said but one word, "Mine." Children said she was carried in by dolphins, and they made games of it, and rhymes, but all of that was just tale-spinning and fun, and no one took it to be true. Others murmured, "Selkie," from time to time when she was remembered, but only as a fanciful tale. The Selkie story of seal creatures were well known, oft told, and in all of them there was a shed skin. Water Claire had come in clothing, though it had been shredded by the greedy winter sea. She was human. There was no seal to her, or mermaid either. She was a human girl sent to them by the sea, who stayed among them for a time, became a woman, and went away again. It was actually old Benedict himself who carried her in when she was seen. Several, including tall Andras, swam out, but it was old Benedict who reached her first, slicing his way through waves with his burly muscled arms. He pried her loose from the wood spar, for her fingers were locked there. He knew how to wrap her lifeless arms around his neck and to hold her pale chin high above the foam and spray. He had brought wounded sheep in from the field this way many times, holding them against his chest. He stood, finally, in the shallow surge and suck of the water, walked forward, his feet heavy in the drenched icy sand, and laid her there. He could see that she still lived, and he covered her with the thick woven coat that he had thrown aside as he entered the sea. Then he turned her wet, pale face to the side. He pressed upon her through the coat until she spewed frothy brine onto the sand and coughed. Tall Andras was there, it is true, and he thought, gazing down, that he wanted the girl for his own, but did not give voice to it. Old Benedict looked up at the surrounding man. "Run ahead," he directed Gavin, who was faster. "Tell Alice we'll carry her there." Hastily, the men gathered poles and coats and made a carrying litter, knowing how to do it, for they had done it many times before. Their children fell from boats and cliffs. Their sons and brothers were wounded by hooks and rope. Their women died giving birth, and the newborns died too. They used such a litter for the slow journey to graveside. But this girl was alive. though her eyes stayed closed and her fingers clenched as if she still felt the splintery mass in them. When they rolled her onto the litter, she coughed again, and when they lifted it to carry her up the hill, a cold breeze picked up a strand of her long wet hair, drawing it across her cheek. Her eyelashes fluttered then, and she began to tremble and whimper. Carefully, in the increasing darkness, for twilight was brief here in winter, they moved with her up the ridge and felt with their feet for the worn path that would take them to the village and to Ellie's hut at its edge. 4 men carried the girl. The others walked behind. Now and then one stopped, turned, and looked out toward the sea and the horizon with its darkening sky, as if searching for the silhouette of a vessel that might have thrown this astonishing gift their way. But there was nothing there but what had always been there, empty ocean the color of pewter, tarnishing to black now as night fell. The village nestled at the foot of a forbidding cliff in the curved elbow of an arm of land. The peninsula jutted out from the main coast in an isolated place where time didn't matter, for nothing changed. No newcomers had ever appeared, not in anyone's memory, and only an occasional discontented man climbed out, for that was what they called the leaving, or tried to. An overgrown, root-tangled path meandered upward at the foot of the cliff, but then disappeared at the base of a sheer rock wall, and after there was no way to go farther but to climb. Several had fallen to their death. One, fierce Einar, had climbed out successfully but returned, embittered by what he had encountered at the top. He had quarreled with his father and climbed out on a winter night with the sack of his own belongings, and some he had stolen, tied to his back. When he returned, climbing back in, it almost killed him, for he was maimed by then, bloody and in terrible pain. He dropped from the final rocks onto the snowy path at the base, howling in agony and with the knowledge of failure. Then he fell silent. He crawled to a place where he could pull down a narrow tree. He stripped it of branches, broke the trunk into 2 pieces, and used them to haul himself upright. Then he leaned on the sticks and dragged himself home to face his father. He lost the title Fierce and was renamed Lame Einar. Still only 18, still silent, he tended sheep now and nursed a deep despair. The best route away from the village was by sea, but the ocean was turbulent and unpredictable, with dangerous currents and constant wind. Each fisherman had found himself in peril more than once, and all had lost friends or brothers. Ellis, toothless and wrinkled, though with piercing eyes and a sharp tongue, told the men roughly, "Leave us be," when they carried the trembling creature in to her. She tended the girl through the night. Alice was childless herself, but had been midwife to many and was no stranger to damaged young. She stripped the girl of the drenched, ripped clothing, setting it aside, then rubbed her dry with rough cloth, and wrapped her in soft wool. She did all this in flickering light from a smoky oil lamp. When the girl stopped shaking, Alice stirred the herb-flavored broth that had been simmering on the fire in an iron pot. She poured some into a bowl and fed the girl from a spoon held carefully, lest she thrust it away in her fear. But the girl sipped, weary at first, then opened her mouth for more. "Go slow or you'll puke," Alice told her. "What brung you?" she asked when the soup bowl was emptied. The girl's head turned and she half rose, listening to the murmur of the sea. But she did not answer, and the old woman did not urge her. Instead, Alice found a comb carved of bones on the shelf nearby, and began to unsnarl and smooth the wet, salt-stiffened hair. The wind howled through the thatch on the roof. It was deepest night now. The girl dozed, half sitting. Finally, Alice lowered her to the bed and pulled a length of wool cloth up around her bare shoulders. She watched for a few moments as the girl slept, her hair fanned about her head. Alice had always yearned for a daughter and felt that the sea had sent this one to her. After a bit, she lowered the flame in the lamp so that the hut was dim, with dark shadows on its walls. She wrapped her own self in a woven blanket, sank into a nearby chair, and slept too. In the morning, the girl woke and wept softly. When she saw her clothing, all rags now encrusted with drying salt, she clutched the tatters, feeling the ruined cloth with her fingers, and then relinquished it all, turning her face to the wall. After a bit, with a resigned sigh, she took the coarse woven shift that Alice offered her, slipped it over her head, and stood. Her bare legs and arms were bruised and scraped. One ankle was badly swollen, and she favored it, limping to the table where Alice had set a bowl of porridge. Her hair was red gold, burnished copper in the early light of winter that came through the small window and fell over her as she ate. The day was fair, as it was often after storms. "What brought you to this place?" Alice asked her again. "What carried you and threw you to the storm?" But again the girl did not answer, though she stared at Alice with her gold-flecked eyes. She had a puzzled look. "Do you not understand our tongue?" Alice asked, knowing that the question was foolish, for if the answer were to be no, then the girl could not understand in order to give it. "I am Alice," the old woman pointed to herself. "Alice," she said again, and patted her own chest in an explanation. "I have no child, none ever. But I have birthed many among our women, and few died in the birthing. They say I have the firm hands and the feel for it. And I also lay out the dead and sometimes can heal if the sickness is not beyond healing. That's why they brought you to me, for they felt you need healing. Or if not healing, then I would clean and wrap you for the grave." The girl was watching her. Her bowl was empty, and she raised a cup of milk beside it and drank deeply. From outside, they could hear suddenly the giggles of children. Alice pushed the window open, peered out, and called to them. "She's alive. She eats and is whole, with no parts broken. Go and tell, and stay off now till she's rested good. She don't need the likes of you laughing and shouting about." "What be her name?" a child's voice called. "Go now. We'll know her name soon enough, or give her one," the woman called, and then there was the sound of the little one scampering away. With her gnarled hand, she smoothed the girl's hair. "It's just the curiosity comes on them. Them three little ones are always together. Best friends, they are. Delwith, Bethan, and Ira be their names. I midwifed each one, same year. 6 they are, and full of the mischief, but they have good hearts and mean no harm." Then the girl spoke. "My name is Claire," she said. 2. They called her Water Claire. People came to Alice's hut during the weeks that passed and brought gifts to Claire, knowing she had nothing of her own. They were a generous people, as a rule. Gareth, his bald head and round cheeks pink with shyness, made shoes for her, leather sandals with straps that she fastened around her ankles over thick knitted socks when the swelling lessened and she could walk without pain. Breen, the mother of little Bethan, stitched a linen petticoat and took the time to embroider flowers on its edge, a fanciful touch beyond the ordinary clothing of the people, but no one scorned Breen for it, for the girl seemed worthy of such a gift. Old Benedict carved her a comb, which she carried in her pocket, and to the surprise of everyone, since he was fierce in his anger and solitude, lame Einar came in from the sheep meadow, hobbling on his 2 sticks, and gave her a hat she had woven her from straw. As spring came, children brought her early wild flowers in small wilting bouquets, and they helped her weave the stems into the straw of the hat's brim. She wore the brimmed hat to keep the sun from her eyes, but even so needed to hold her hand there when she looked to sea because the light reflecting off the gray-white waves was blinding. She stood often on the shore with the wind blowing her hair and molding her skirt against her legs. She watched the horizon as if she waited, but she had no knowledge of what she waited for. The sea had drunk her memories away, leaving only her name. "How old do you be, Waterclaire?" asked a half-grown, freckle-faced boy named Sindri. He measured himself beside her, and she was the taller, but she shook her head, not knowing how to answer him. Alice was there. They were gathering herbs. 16 or so, Alice said, telling Claire more than the boy. And they knew Alice to be true in her guess, for it was she who tended the bodies of them all, and knew the signs that each year brings. 16, Waterclaire repeated in her soft voice, and though she said no more, they knew that she was mourning the knowledge of the years that the sea had gulped away. She watched the little girls at play, laughing as they ran through the meadow, quick and colorful as butterflies. But there was sadness in the watching, for Claire's meadow days had been taken from her. They did not come back, even in dreams. 16? Tall Andres repeated when he heard of it. The boy Sindri had told everyone, and most had shrugged. But tall Andres rubbed his hand across his thick blond beard, looked across the marketplace to where Waterclaire stood fingering ribbons at a stall, and said to his mates, she could be wed. It was true that in this place there were often girls given as brides at that age. Even now the village was preparing for a wedding. Gladys, shy and sparkle-eyed, would soon wed horse tender to Martin, she not yet 17 and he barely 20. But old Benedict and Alice both said no, not this girl. Not Waterclaire, she must not wed, they said firmly, until the sea gave her back what it had stolen, until she knew what her life had once been. Tall Andres, frowning with disappointment, asked brusquely, "What if it never do?" "It will," old Benedict replied. "Bits and pieces, they'll come," Alice said, "over time." Tall Andres glowered. He had a fierce want for the girl. "The sea pukes up dead fish," he said. "It won't give her back anything. What the sea coughs up smells of rot." "You smells of sweat yourself, Andres," Alice told him, laughing at his misery. "And should bathe if you want the girl to come close. Wash your hair and chew some mint. Maybe then she'll give you a smile some morning." Tall Andres stalked away, but she could see that he was headed to the freshwater pond beyond the thick trees at the edge of the village. Old Benedict, watching, shook his head and smiled. "I told him she'll come back to herself, but truly, I don't know," he told Alice. "It's as if the sea sucked away her past and left her empty. What does she say to you?" "She remembers only waking in my hut, nothing before. Not even being in the sea." They walked together along the rocky path bordering a wide meadow, each of them with the stick to lean on. Old Benedict was strong still, but bent. Alice, too, walked with her back hunched. They had been friends for more than 60 years. Alice carried the basket she used for gathering herbs. She was in need of raspberry leaf on this morning, to steep for tea to give Breen. Since birthing Bethan 6 years before, Breen had lost 3 babies and had fallen into despair. Now she was again with child, and Alice would prepare the raspberry leaf infusion for her to drink 3 times a day, something it tightened and held the pregnancy. "Is there no herb for memory?" Old Benedict asked her as she leaned to strip the raspberry leaves from the thick thorn bushes where they grew. Alice chuckled. "Aye," she told him. "Try this." She reached to a nearby tree, peeled a tiny shred of bark, and placed it in his hand. "Chew and think back." Frowning, puzzled, old Benedict placed the shred on his own tongue. "Think back on what?" "On a time you choose, far back." She watched him. He closed his eyes and chewed. Bitter, he said, making a face. She laughed. After a moment, he opened his eyes and spat the chewed bark from his tongue. I thought back to the day we danced, he told her with a wry smile. I was 13, she said. You were the same, a long way back. Was the memory clear? He nodded. You had pink flowers in your hair, he said. She nodded. Beach roses, it was midsummer. And barefoot. Yours were bare too. It was a warm day. Aye, the grass was warm and damp. Dew, he said. It was early morning. He looked at her for a moment. Why were we dancing? He asked, his brow furrowed. Mayhap you need to chew the bark again, she chuckled, to remember why. You tell me, he said. Alice added the last of the raspberry leaves to her basket, straightened, took up her stick, and turned on the path. Back to the hut, she said. My kettle's a-boil, and I must steep the leaves. She began to walk away from him. Shall you take some of the bark for the girl? For water, Claire? He asked. She turned back to him and crinkled a smile at him. The bark does not, she said. It's only the turning your mind to it, making your mind go back. She'll do that when she's ready, she added. I must go now. Breen is in need of the tea. He called after her as she walked away on the path. Alice, why were we dancing? Take your mind there again, she called back. You'll remember. To herself she murmured, shaking her head with amusement as her eyes twinkled at her own memory. Only 13, but we was barefoot and flower-strewn and foolish with first love. 3. Claire was there, at the hut, with her coppery hair tied back by a ribbon, and a cloth tied around her waist to protect her simple homemade skirt. She was chopping the long pale green stems of early onions fresh from the garden. Newly picked greens lay heaped on the table with the thick mutton bone near them, ready to add to the pot of water that was already simmering over the fire. When Alice entered, she smiled. I'm starting soup, the girl said. Aye, I see that. Alice emptied her basket of raspberry leaves into a bowl. I'll just take some of the water first for my brew. With a ladle, she slowly poured hot water from the pot over the leaves. Steam rose as the leaves began to steep and tint the liquid. For Breen, the girl looked at the darkening tea. Aye, to lose another will surely make her heart sick. Claire leaned toward the bowl. As Alice watched, she closed her eyes and breathed the steam. At her forehead, tendrils of hair curled from the moisture, framing her pale face. For a moment, she stood there, motionless, breathing. Then she gasped, drew her head back, opened her eyes, and looked around with a puzzled gaze. I cannot, she began, then fell silent. Alice went to her and smoothed the damp hair. What is it, child? She asked. I thought, but the girl couldn't continue. Moving tentatively, she sat down in the nearby rocker and stared into the fire. Ellie watched her for a moment. Then she went to the trunk against the wall. Unopened for years, it bore an iron clasp that was rusty and worn, but Ellie's strong fingers pried it to loose, and she raised the heavy carved lid. Her father had made this trunk for her mother almost a century before, a bright gift when they were wed. It had come to Alice when her mother died. Her mother had stored things in it, linens and baby dresses, sprinkled with dried lavender blossoms. None of those things remained, though the scent of the lavender lingered. Alice used the trunk only for treasures, and there were few enough of those in her life. Now she reached through the things within and took from the near bottom of the fragile bit of folded cloth. Holding it, she went to the rocker and said to the girl, "Watch now." Gently, she unfolded the cloth and showed her bits of torn brown shreds. "Smell," Alice told her, and held it to the girl's nose. "Old," Claire said. "Sweet." She leaned back in the chair and sighed. What is it? Beach roses from 60 years ago. Why, to hold memories. Scents do that. When you smell the tea. Yes, for a moment something came back, the girl acknowledged. Like a bit of breeze, it drifted past. I couldn't keep it with me. I wanted, but she couldn't say what she wanted. She sighed and shook her head. It went away. It's waiting, Alice said. Carefully, she refolded the cloth around the dried petals and leaves and replaced the little packet in the calf's trunk. Then, while Claire watched, she strained the dark tea and poured it carefully into small bottles, which she corked tightly. I'll take this now to Bryn, she said. Add a raspberry leaf or two to the soup, and some of that sorrel from the garden. It'll give flavor, she added. Those greens you have give bulk, but their taste is ordinary. Claire nodded. Alice watched as the girl pushed the chopped onions into a neat pile with the side of her hand. Did you cook once, mayhap? Alice asked. The girl looked up. She frowned and furrowed her brow. I don't think so, she said finally. But something come back to you a minute ago, Alice said, when you breathed the tea. Claire stood thinking. She closed her eyes. Then finally she looked up and shrugged. It wasn't the tea, she said. It came from something else, I think. You talk elegant, Alice said with a chuckle. Probably somebody done your cooking for you once. Claire took a deep breath, still thinking. Then she picked up the stirring spoon and turned toward the pot of simmering soup. Well, she said, those days are gone. The three little girls, Bethan, Delwith, and Ira, barefoot and grass-stained, smoothed and tidied the little corner of meadow that they called their tea place. A flat rock there became their table. They decorated with blossoms from the clumps of wild flowers nearby. With a leafy branch acting as a broom, Ira swept the ground around the rock. Sit down, dear ladies, she said. Now that it's tidy here, we'll have tea. It was a game they often played, serving imaginary tea to one another, pretending to be grown women. Your hair is a wee bit straggled, Miss Bethan, Ira said haughtily as she set the broom aside. Was you rushed? I'd expect you'd be more primed up and maybe brush some when you've got a tea invite. Bethan giggled and pulled at her unruly curls. So sorry, Miss Ira, she said. This baby in my belly makes me forgetful. Dramatically, she pulled her frock away from her own thin middle. Can I have a belly baby too? Whispered solemn-eyed Delwith. Yes, let's all. Ira tugged at her own skirt. Oh, I do hope mine is born soon, because I'm so weary of being fat. Yes, fat is hard. Delwith agreed in a serious voice. It makes your breath all puffy. When do you expect yours? She asked the others. Mine's coming tomorrow. I do hope for a boy. I'm going to name him. She pondered briefly. Dylan, she decided. Tea? Delicately, she sipped from her own imaginary cup. Whoops, Bethan announced. Mine just be born, a little girl. She cradled in an invisible baby in her arms. Mine too, the other two little girls announced. Rhythmically, they rocked their invisible infants. My mom be cross with me if she knew we did this, Bethan confided. She says it'd be bad luck to pretend about a baby. Delwith stopped her rocking motion. Bad luck? Bethan nodded. Better we don't do it then. We can pretend tea, though. Delwith smoothed her skirt. Want a tea cake? She offered the other girls each a twig. Ira pretended to chew. You be a fine cook, Miss Delwith, she said. Delwith nodded solemnly. I learned it from the Queen, she said, when I'd be a helper in her kitchen. Claire, listening from where she stood in a small grove of trees nearby, smiled at the sweetness of the children. But their conversation troubled her as well, because it reminded her of what she had lost. It was more than the loss of memories. She had no knowledge. She wondered what a queen might be. Had she known that once? Has she played this way once? This baby in my belly makes me forgetful, one little girl had said. Claire, working now with Alice, preparing the herbs for Bethan's mother, understood what the child was pretending. Why did it make Claire feel so unbearably sad? She straightened her straw hat and walked slowly back to the hut with the herbs she had been sent to find and gather. She resolved that she would learn. She would learn everything about queens, whatever they were, and herbs and birds, and how the men farmed and what they thought, and the women too, how they spent their hours and what they talked about, what they dreamed, what they yearned for. It would be a start, Claire thought. Perhaps somehow she would learn for her own lost life. From a field higher up, where he was prying weeds from the rocky soil with his hoe, tall Andres stopped his work, wiped sweat from his glistening forehead, and watched the mysterious girl walk along the path. She had favored one leg for some weeks, until the bruise and swelling disappeared. He had worried for her that she might become hunched and lame, as people did when their wounds went unhealed. Andra's father flung years before against rocks when a boat swung around and tipped, still held one arm locked into a curved and crooked shape. But he could see that Water Claire strode easily now along the path, her legs strong and equal, her feet sure in the soft leather sandals she wore. He watched her make her way easily to the turning. Then she disappeared into the woods, heading back to the hut she shared with Alice. A shadow across the ground in front of him, and tall Andres looked up and waved his arm at the crows that circled the field. His weeding was turning up bugs and worms, morsels that the crows wanted, he knew, and it put his seedling at risk. He couldn't afford to lose the crops. Winter was long here, and in the good weather seasons they prepared for it, growing, catching, storing things away. His father was getting old, and his mother had been unwell for months, with fever that came and went. Tall Andras was young, just 17, but the family depended on him. He would make a bird scarer, a marmot, he decided. Last summer that had helped, and he had a large gourd in the shed that he could use for a hat, with a face carved on it, a fierce face. He twisted his own face, practicing, pushing his lips up against his nose, and then flapped his arms, the way the cloth of his marmot might flap in the wind to frighten away the crows. Then he stopped, feeling childish and foolish, and glad that the girl had not seen. For her, he wanted to seem a wise and hard-working man, worthy soon of a wife. 4. They noticed that creatures frightened her. A chipmunk, tamed by the little girls, sat on Ira's hand nibbling at the seeds they gave to it, but Claire backed away with a startled look. You never seen one before, then, Water Claire? Bethan asked her. They not be harmful. You can touch him, Delwith suggested. He don't mind. But Claire shook her head no. She was fearful of the smallest creatures. A mouse scurrying across the floor of Alice's hut almost caused her to faint, and fascinated in a worried sort of way with birds. She found frogs amusing but strange, but she was completely, utterly terrified of cows. Claire held her breath and looked away when she had to pass the place where a scrawny milk cow, its wrinkled mouth moving as it placidly chewed on the rough grass, was fenced beside the cottage where tall Andres lived with his parents. I must try to learn creatures, she said to Alice apologetically. It's not right to be so fearful. Even the smallest of the children feel at home with the creatures. Mayhap you had a run-in with the creature once. Alice was in the rocker, knitting with gray wool in the dim, flickering light. Claire sighed. I don't know, but it's not a feeling of a bad memory. It's as if I have never seen them before. Fish neither? Fish are familiar, Claire said slowly. I think I have known of fish somehow. They don't frighten me. I like how silvery they look. Nary birds? Claire shook her head and shuddered. Their wings seem so unnatural. I can't get used to them. Even the littlest ones are strange to me. Alice thought and rocked. Her wooden needles clicked in her gnarled hands. Finally, she said, Lane Minor has a way with birds. I'll have him catch us one for a pet. Pet? A plaything. A pretty. He'll make a cage for it from twigs. Claire cringed at the thought, but agreed. It would be a start to the learning. One afternoon, she stood barefoot on the beach, watching the trio of little girls. Using sticks, they had outlined the house and were furnishing it with debris they found in the sand. Here's my bed, Bethan announced, and patted an armful of seaweed into a shape. And cups in the kitchen. Ira set 5 scoop-shaped shelves in a row. She lifted one daintily and pretended to drink from it. Delwith ran to fetch a branch she saw beside some rocks and dragged it back. Torn from a nearby tree by the constant wind, it was crowned with a thicket of leaves. Broom! I found us a broom! The little girl announced happily and scraped the sand with it. Wait, it needs fixing. Carefully, she tugged at a thin side branch, broke it loose, and tossed it aside. There, now it's a proper broom. Claire, watching, leaned down and picked up the slender branch that Delwith had discarded. The sand was damp, and she saw her own footprints in it. With the tip of the branch, she poked a round hole in each of her own toe prints, then laughed and scribbled the footprints away with the stick. A gentle surge of seawater moved in silently, smoothed the roughened sand, and receded. She leaned forward and wrote the first letter of her name, C. Then L and A. But a foamy inrush of seawater erased the letters. Claire moved back slightly, farther from the sea's edge, and began again. Claire, she wrote. What be that? A shadow fell across her letters. It was Bethan, looking down. My name. The little girl stared at it. Would you like to do your name beside it? Claire offered her the stick. How? She asked. Just make the letters. What be letters? Claire was startled at first. Then she thought, oh, they haven't learned yet. She had a sudden image of herself learning. Of a teacher explaining the sounds of letters. There was a place she had gone, a place called school. All children did, but she looked around now at the cliff and hills and huts, at the sea. She could see the boats bobbing in the distance and the men leaning in with their nets, and she was uncertain. Will you go to school soon? She asked Bethan. What be school? She didn't know how to answer the child, and maybe she realized it wasn't important. 6 letters, they made a name. What did it matter? She looked again at the word she had written, then erased it with her own toes, stamped the sand firm, and tossed the stick into a pile of glistening kelp nearby. Alice had sent old Benedict to ask the favor of lame Einar. Not long after, slow on his ruined feet, the young man made his way laboriously down from his hut on the hillside, carrying the twig cage on his back with the bird inside. Here it be, he told Alice. Einar was not one for talking. His failures had made him a reckless, but people remembered the vulnerable boy he had once been. Though he had stolen from his father, they forgave him that. His father had been a harsh and unjust man. That he had climbed out, many admired, for the cliff was steep and jagged and the world beyond unknown. Few had the courage that Einar had had. They regretted his failure, but they welcomed his damaged return. Einar, though, had never forgiven himself. He lived in self-imposed shame and stayed mostly silent. It sings, he said. He leaned his 2 sturdy sticks against the Alice hut and hung the cage on a tree branch near the entrance. He watched for a moment until the carefully crafted perch inside stopped swaying, and the little finch stilled the nervous flutter of its bright-colored wings. Then lame Einar took up his sticks again. He righted himself between them for balance and went slowly away. The bird was chirping when Claire returned from the beach, carrying her sandals. She stopped in surprise, looking at the cage and the bird within. It can't get out, can it? she asked nervously. Alice laughed. Were you to take it in your hand, child, it would tremble in fear. Have you never been near to a wee bird before? Claire shook her head no. You'll feed it each day, seeds mostly, and some of the bugs from the field. I don't like the bugs, Claire whispered. It will help when you learn them. Fear dims when you learn things. The bird chirped loudly, and Claire jumped. Alice laughed at her again. Claire took a breath and calmed herself. She went closer and peered into the cage. The bird tilted its head and looked back at her. It should have a name, Claire said. Name it then. It be yours. I've never named a single thing. Alice frowned, and she looked at Claire with her squinted eyes. Do you know then that? She asked. Claire sighed. I feel it, that's all. Naming is hard. Someone named you once. Claire looked away. I suppose, she said slowly, and then turned her attention again to the cage. Look, it cleans itself, she pointed. The bird had raised one wing and pecked fastidiously at its feathers beneath. Isn't that a lovely patch of color on his wing? She hesitated, then asked, What is it called? I know red. You taught me red from the berries. It's a pretty red there around his eyes, but what is that bright color on his wing? I can't think of its name. Alice were troubled by this, for she knew by now that the girl was clever and filled with knowledge of many things, but she seemed lacking in so many ways, and the realm of colors was one. The names of the various hues were one of the first things small children learned. Yet, when Alice had sent Claire on a simple errand some days ago, asking her to fetch some jewelweed, which Alice needed to treat a painful poison ivy rash on one of the old Benedict's grandsons, Claire had not known how to find the flower that grew in such profusion by the stream. The bright orange blossoms, Alice reminded her. We gathered them the other day. I forget orange, Claire had said, embarrassed. We gathered several things that day. What does orange look like? And now she could not name the color that decorated the wing of the little singing finch. Yellow, Alice told her. The same as evening primrose, remember? Yellow, Claire repeated, learning it. Yellow wing became the bird's name. On a cool, foggy morning, she climbed the hill to find lame Einar and thank him. It had taken a while to accustom herself to the bird, to end her fearfulness around it, but now it hopped to the side of the cage when she brought seeds to it in a little shell dish and waited, head cocked, while she set the dish down. It would have popped onto her finger, she knew, if she had held it still and waited, but she wasn't ready for that, or for the feeding of live insects. The little girls took on that task, happy to find beetles and hoppers in the grass and bring them to Yellow Wing. She found Einar near his hut. He was seated on a flat rock, cleaning a wooden bowl, scrubbing the cracks in the rounded poplar with a rag dipped in a fire ash. Nearby, through the fog, she could hear the sheep move in the grass and an occasional bleat. She approached the young man. She was nervous, not to be with Einar, who was always silent and unknowable, but because of the sounds of the animals. He was startled to see her, and lowered his eyes to the bowl. Had he heard her coming, he would have fled into the fog and disappeared. But Claire had been silent, appearing without warning from the swirling gray mist, and his maimed feet made it impossible for him to jump and run. Good morning, she said, and he nodded in reply. I came to thank you for the bird, she told him. It's not but a bird, he muttered. Claire stared at him for a moment. A word came to her from nowhere. He's lonely, she thought. People say he's angry and hermit-like, but it's loneliness that afflicts him. She looked around and saw a log nearby. May I sit down? She asked politely. He grunted an assent and scraped some more at the spotless bowl in his hand. I know it's just a bird, she told him, but you see, I have been afraid of birds. They're strange to me. I don't know why. And so the little bird you brought me, I call him Yellow Wing. She saw his puzzled look and laughed. I know, it's just his color, but I'm only learning colors. They are as strange to me as birds. And so it's a help to call him Yellow Wing. I say his name when I put his dish of seeds in the cage. And you know what? He is singing now. He was afraid at first, but now he sings. Einar looked at her. Then he arranged his mouth, gave a small sound as a trial, and then reproduced the sound of the small bright-colored bird with its shrill and fluttering whistle. Claire listened in delight. Could you do the songs of other birds? She asked him, but he ducked his head in embarrassment and didn't reply. He set the bowl aside and reached for his sticks. Sheep need me, he said brusquely. He rose and moved with his awkward gait into the edge of the foggy meadow. He was no more than a blurred outline when she heard him call back to her. Greens, he called. Not the color, but he needs greens. Willow buds be good, and dandelion. Then he was gone, but as she gathered herself to leave, she heard him whistle the song of the bird once again. Alice and old Benedict stood watching the preparation for the marriage of Glenys and Martine. Friends of the couple had built a kind of bower from supple willow branches, and now they were decorating it with blossoms and ferns. Beyond, on tables made of board and set outside for the occasion, the women were arranging food and drink. It's a fine day, Alice commented, squinting at the cloudless sky. I was wet in rain, old Benedict said with a chuckle, and never noticed a drop of it. She smiled at him. I remember your wedding day, she said, and Alice, all smiles. You must miss her, Ben. He nodded. His wife of many years had died from a sudden fever that winter before, with their children and grandchildren watching in sorrow. She was buried now in the village graveyard with a small stone marker marking her place, and room beside her for old Benedict when his time came. Look there at tall Andras watching the girl, old Benedict said with a chuckle, and pointed. He's bent near double with longing for her, isn't it so? They both watched with amusement as the young man's lovesick gaze followed Claire, who was helping with the flowers. She hardly noticed them. She puzzles me, Benedict. Aye, she's a mystery, but a splendid one. While they watched, Claire lifted one of the little girls and helped her weave daisies into the twigs of the bower. The other little ones waited eagerly for their turns. They follow her like kittens after the mother cat, don't they? Do you know she fears cats, even kittens? As if she never sees such before, Alice told them. And birds, I hear. Lay Einar caught a bird for her, and wove a cage for it. She's learning to like it now, for it sings nicely. But, Ben, I had to tell her the colors of it. She don't know the names, yellow and red. It's as if they are new to her, and yet she's clever. Clever as can be. She creates games for the little girls and helps me with the herbs, but I never knowed one who couldn't say the colors. Not even one who is weak in the mind like Alish's nephew, who's like a young boy though he's 30. Even he cries for his blue shirt instead of the green, old Benedict said. Not worry, Claire. She may long for the blue, but don't know its name. She's learning now, but she's like a babe about it. So you've got you a wee babe to tend, after all these years without, he teased her. He patted her hip through her thick skirt, and she pushed his hand away. Let me be, you old fool, she told him fondly.